Welcome everyone to Conversations in Lung Cancer Research, a TOGA podcast where we discuss the latest breakthroughs in lung cancer research and treatment for Australia and New Zealand. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and we also extend that respect to all Indigenous people. My name is Mel Moore. I'm a medical oncologist at St Vincent's in Melbourne. And in today's episode, I'm very pleased to be speaking to Professor Michael Millward. Michael will be known to many who are listening to this podcast, but he is the Foundation Professor of Clinical Cancer Research at the University of Western Australia and the Oncology Medical Director at Linear Clinical Research in Perth. He's also an adjunct professor in the School of Biomedical Sciences at the Edith Cowan University, and he has extensive clinical and research interests in lung cancer and melanoma, immune therapeutics, and the early phase testing of new cancer treatments. Michael's published over 250 original papers and over 400 abstracts at international meetings. In 2017, he received the Cancer Council WA Career Achievement Award. And for those of you who are at the ASM last year will remember that he was awarded a TOGA Lifetime Achievement Award for his services to thoracic oncology research. I'd like to welcome Michael to TOGA's Conversation in Lung Cancer Research podcast. Great to see you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Mel, and thanks for your kind words. And it's a pleasure to see you and to talk to you this afternoon.
So, Michael, we're going to get onto the serious stuff first, but I thought I would start with something that you would definitely not remember. We have known each other throughout time in ALTG and TOGA, but we actually met for the first time over 25 years ago. So I was a graduate medical student at Uni of Sydney and RPA was my clinical school. You were a medical oncologist at RPA and you were taking our 4-person tutorial group. I think it was communication skills, clinical skills for a weekly tutorial. And it was always held, I think, after a multidisciplinary team meeting that was clearly sponsored by a drug company. I remember meeting in the MDM room at Gloucester House at RPA, and there was always leftover platters of food from the meeting, platters of sandwiches, platters of fruit. And as 4 hungry medical students, this was just nirvana to us, and it was the highlight of our week. And I remember it very well. So that was before I even had an inkling of being an oncologist. Quite interesting that has stuck with me.
I'd like to say I remember that, Mel, but I do remember the events, but I don't remember all the students. But
no
I hope you enjoyed it and found those tutorials useful.
I must have done, because here I am.
As well as taking away your lunchtime hungers.
Michael, I usually start these podcasts by asking people to give a little bit of a summary of how they've got to where they are in terms of their education and their career trajectory.
Well, I grew up in Perth in Western Australia, and I went to medical school at the University of Western Australia. And then I started as a junior doctor at Sir Charles Gardner Hospital. And fairly on, I was exposed to medical oncology, and I thought, wow, that's a really exciting and interesting thing. And as I decided I would go into some area of medical specialisation, I always kept that in my mind. I started with the idea that I might do clinical pharmacology because that always interested me when I was a medical student. But I then discovered at that time you couldn't train in clinical pharmacology in Western Australia. There were no accredited training positions. But I was fortunate to be continually exposed to medical oncology as a resident and as a service registrar. So it was, once I learnt that I could train in medical oncology, it was an easy decision to apply for it.
And then I noticed you spent a bit of time away from Perth then. Was that by choice, necessity? How did that come about?
I think Perth was pretty small and isolated, even more so back then. It really is a necessity to think about spending some time away from Perth during training. At that time, there was only one medical oncology trainee in the state. You had no contemporaries, you had no circle. So at the end of a couple of years of advanced training, I was fortunate to get a position in the UK, which was focused very much on drug development and early phase trials. So that really got me into that. I was then fortunate enough to be given a position at Peter MacCallum as a consultant in the early 1990s. I stayed there for 6 years or so, and then I went to Sydney as for 5 years or so, and then in 2003 we returned to Perth to the university position that I have now.
And Michael, you're involved in melanoma and lung cancer. Was that a conscious choice, or it was as it is for some of us, you'd end up in those cancer types that your department needs you to do and then grow an interest?
Yeah, very much that. When I was a trainee, there was virtually no subspecialisation. Everybody did virtually everything. And it was only when I was at Peter Mac, and when I joined Peter Mac, it was the same. But then one afternoon, which I remember very well, the medical oncologists all sat down together and said, we think we should start subspecialising and everybody should do what was termed a major tumour type and a minor tumour type. And I said, okay, major, I'll do lung, and minor, because no one else wanted to, I said, I'll do melanoma. But I had not at that time particularly done a lot in those tumour types. I'd done trials and research in other cancers as well. So I could very well have ended up doing gynae oncology or urologic tumours or anything else for that matter. And it's remarkable when you think of it that your whole future career depends on a sort of an afternoon where everyone sit down and divides things up. So I think in a way I was lucky to get tumour types where there was a lot going to happen in terms of new treatments, but obviously melanoma nowadays is far more of a major tumour types than it was back then when there was really very little in the way of useful medical oncology treatment at all.
Quite fortuitous in hindsight that those two tumour types have ended up being really at the forefront of new therapeutics, particularly in immune therapy. I guess back then you probably would have thought that your time in melanoma was going to be fairly quiet, but I'd imagine it's a big part of your work now.
Not so much now. In the last few years, I've really done only early phase clinical trials. I've stepped away from the routine thoracic and melanoma practice, and there are other very good people now that do that in Perth, so I'm very happy with that. I still spend quite a lot of time doing molecular type things because I think molecular oncology in terms of testing and matching trials is something that virtually didn't exist when I started in medical oncology. So not just for immunotherapy, I've been fortunate to do major cancer types that have really led the introduction of precision oncology into clinical practice.
Michael, I noticed that you've been on an MRFF grant in recent years looking at that very area and liquid biopsy in particular. Could you elaborate on how that's been going?
Yes, I've been involved in both the tissue-most and prospect studies that are still ongoing, plus the toga-led aspiration studies, which are now focusing on liquid biopsies. And I've done quite a number of research collaborations over the years in the liquid biopsy space. I think it's going to become very much the future of medical oncology. I think in 5 to 10 years' time, when a medical oncologist talks to a patient about getting a blood test, it will mean we're getting an idea of your cancer's molecular type, its progress, and its developing, if any, resistance mechanisms. It won't just mean we're getting a full blood count and some biochemistry.
And do you think at the moment the reason that we don't have that readily available, is that a funding issue, or do you think that the technology and the validation is not quite ready for prime time?
No, I think the technology is pretty well established, and I think it's evolving all the time. I think one of our difficulties we've had in Australia ever since the first liquid biopsies has been we haven't had a clear recognition that molecular targets detected by liquid biopsy should lead to PBS reimbursable decisions. We've been wedded to them being tied to tissue testing, And that has undoubtedly meant that we're not as advanced in terms of liquid diagnostics in routine care in Australia as we should be, which is a pity because we've had some fantastic programs looking at prognostication, de-escalation of therapy in some cancers led in Australia. And this is really changing for patients and for health systems. So we need to embrace this diagnostic a lot more.
And Michael, apart from that challenge that you've identified, are there other major challenges that you've experienced you foresee its thoracic malignancy research and molecular research?
I think there's always challenges, Mel, but there's always fantastic opportunities as well. And we're so much more knowledgeable about cancer biology and linking that to cancer treatments than we were when I started in medical oncology, that it really is a different world. And we have made substantial advances, and the number of patients being cured with both melanomas and thoracic cancers that would otherwise not have been 10 plus years ago is remarkable. And it's challenged not just therapeutic paradigms, how we see oncology care as what was largely a palliative type intent treatment to a much more nuanced type treatment with much greater expectation of long-term survival, which is wonderful for patients and wonderful for practitioners.
It's very much changed the conversation we're having with those patients now.
Absolutely,
we can
yes.
actually maybe start talking about the cure word. We've all got patients that are 10 years and beyond on immunotherapy with stage 4 disease that previously would not have lived that long. Was that interest in molecular oncology and I guess also your pharmacology interest, is that the impetus for heading into a more phase 1 focused direction?
I was always interested in early phase drug development, basically regardless of what type of drugs it happened to be. But I think now we're seeing far more phase 1 studies that are reporting not just an MTD or toxicities, but real promising anti-tumor activity, and drugs have been approved for use based on largely phase 1 studies, particularly if the population is rare. So it's become much more therapeutic, if you like, and much more satisfying because many patients are experiencing real therapeutic benefit from early phase involvement. And again, that lifts not just the patient, but it lifts the whole team involved in it.
I think it's a bit of a change in mindset, isn't it? Because I guess we're always taught that phase 1 trials are for toxicity and dose finding, but you're right. I think we are seeing more people that are getting responses now, and I think that changes the conversation when you're talking to patients about phase 1 studies, wanting to give some sort of degree of hope, but not wanting to overpromise either.
Sure, and I think that's a thing that will flow back and forth. But I think what we have learnt is that there is much more promise in new therapeutics than we perhaps considered that there might be. And that now that we have made these advances, there's no reason that we'll be stuck where we are now. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see significant advances in solid tumour cell therapies and potentially in things that we haven't even considered at the moment as being particularly promising or even particularly novel. Predicting the future is a very difficult thing to do, and I think if you think you could do it, you're much more likely to be wrong than right.
No, absolutely. And I'm sure when you chose melanoma as your secondary tumour, you never would have in a million years thought that you're going to be in this position of melanoma treatment today.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was, as I said, it was literally a combination of the fact that I could see it being focused on early drug development and that nobody else particularly wanted to do it. So I figured if I got the one that nobody wanted for my minor, I might get the one I did want for my major.
Good strategy. It's worked out for you. Michael, so you're the medical director of Linear. And my understanding is that you were quite integral in setting that up. Have I got that correct?
I was the first medical oncologist to do phase 1 studies in Linear. We now have quite a big team, which is great. I was the clinical lead in oncology for a long time, but I've recently handed that over. Last year, Linear built, actually not last year, the year before, Linear built a new facility for cancer trials, and we decided we'd seek accreditation as a private hospital, which we were successful in, but part of the mechanics of doing that is you have to have a medical director role that's defined. So I took on that role, which was an administrative role rather than anything unique in terms of clinical work. But in recent months, I've handed that role over as well. So my role at Linear now is basically as an experienced clinical trialist, still doing a lot of early phase studies there, but away from the sort of administrative workload.
I'd imagine, though, that building a phase 1 unit from zero to the sort of levels that you've got at the moment is no small undertaking.
It's one of these things that developed over time. I started working at Linear in about 2011. It's not a recent occurrence, but like all things, eventually it just seems to take off, and then you get that sort of critical mass of people and it has a momentum all of its own. So, yeah, I'm very happy with how it's developed, and I think it's been very good in Western Australia for attracting drug trials and allowing us to do a lot more phase 1 work than would otherwise have been possible.
And Michael, just in terms of getting drugs from that preclinical phase to market, what are the main challenges in that happening for new agents, aside from efficacy, obviously, but what other challenges are there for getting drugs, I guess, from the bench to the bedside?
I think you need good preclinical experiments, you need good preclinical toxicology, but you also need a realistic and well thought out drug development plan. Companies that do this are often overly optimistic, and they're often going for tumour types based on market share and market potential rather than necessarily what the best tumour type biologically to show benefit from their drug may be. And I think a lot of companies tend to underestimate the time involved in this process. It's not a quick process to take a drug from a promising scientific discovery to first-in-human testing. It takes time, it takes planning, and it takes a lot of thought.
Do you feel like you're able to have input into some of those things that you alluded to about the tumour types, for example, and the plan, or are you mainly presented with a fait accompli?
I think good companies will listen to investigators, and I would hope that investigators would give this advice and give it careful consideration. Obviously, I don't expect any company to necessarily agree with what I say. They may well have other opinions, but I think just being presented with fait accompli is not all that satisfying. To some extent, it depends on the size of the company. Often smaller companies are more flexible and more willing to listen to advice from investigators because they're not particularly heavy in terms of internal expertise and experience.
Mike, we're just going to take a step back. As I mentioned in the introduction, you're the Foundation Professor of Clinical Cancer Research at UWA. What does that entail? How does that affect your day-to-day work?
The position that I have at the University of Western Australia was set up with initial funding from the Cancer Council of Western Australia, specifically to develop clinical cancer research as an academic pathway and an academic presence in Western Australia. And I was very glad to be offered this position, and it's been a very great pleasure to be in this position for the last 22 years. On a day-to-day basis, my work is all fairly seamless. I don't consider at a certain time of the week I'm doing only university things, and another time of the week I'm only doing clinical trials or linear things or administration. It's all fairly seamless. But it does mean that I've got time to devote to clinical research and clinical trials. That was the aim of the position, and it's been tremendous to be able to integrate clinical research into all my clinical work since I came back to Perth.
And I'd imagine that's across cancer types, not just melanoma in a particular role.
Certainly at the beginning, I saw my role, and still do very much, in working with others in different areas to set up research and trials and to ensure that we have spectrum of clinical trials. That means that the large majority of cancer patients will be eligible because they've got a cancer type for which there is a trial. So, yeah, it's certainly been wonderful to see the progress that's been made. And I think West Australia now is got a very active clinical trials set up, not just in early phase, but in across clinical trials and across the major public and private institutions.
So, Michael, it's clear that you've been very much at the forefront of that. You must have mentored a lot of people through your career that you're now seeing coming through and taking on senior roles and clinical trials as well. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely it is. And I think my goal has always been to try and advocate that younger medical oncologists who are starting their career develop an interest in research and in clinical trials, not necessarily the same interests that I have. They have some interest in an area or areas of research that will allow them to supplement their clinical work by becoming involved in research. Now, that doesn't necessarily appeal to absolutely everybody. As long as it appeals to a reasonable number, then we will always have an academic presence in terms of how we think about medical oncology. But I'm very happy. I support people who want to do qualitative research, who want to do patient outcome research, who want to do any type of research that will ultimately lead to practice improvements, because that's what it's all about.
So, Michael, just in practical terms, if you've got a registrar coming to you that says they want to have a career that includes clinical work and research, they just don't quite know how to go about that, what practical advice do you give them?
If they're coming as a new first-year medical oncology trainee, my advice would be to get the basic core years behind you, get comfortable with what medical oncology is, and then look later in your advanced training or early in your post-fellowship years at undertaking some type of research fellowship. There are many excellent places in the country and overseas where you can profitably spend time as a clinical research or research fellow and then get skills in undertaking trials, in working on clinical protocols, and in working with translational research teams. I always tell younger oncology trainees, don't get too focused on where you think you're going to get a consultant job, or don't try and plan your career in too much detail at the beginning. If you gain those skills in thinking about research and clinical trials, it doesn't particularly matter if you end up doing predominantly lung cancer or breast cancer or prostate cancer or whatever. Those skills will still be of great value to you. And we do see sometimes trainees trying to guess too early on in their career what they think there's going to be a shortage of in terms of people doing tumour types and just saying, that's what I'm going to do.
I think you've got to have some sort of degree of interest and passion, don't you? Otherwise, it's a tough job. Michael, on a similar theme, As a collaborative group like TOGA and other collaborative groups, how can we create the right environment for the next generation of trialists to build trial careers like you've had?
I think we're fairly fortunate in Australia that we have a good network of clinical trial groups that encompasses all the tumour types, plus some groups that are looking at not just a particular tumour type, but a particular area. So I think for younger consultants in particular, joining these groups and looking at their trials and asking how they can be involved as investigators on trials. Obviously, if you're going to undertake clinical trials or any area of clinical research, you need to work in an environment where that is wanted and welcomed. So that really much depends on the more senior people in departments and in hospitals, making sure that younger people have that opportunity, and if they want to, are encouraged and given the opportunity to do. I think cooperative groups are great, but the trials are done in our hospitals and in our clinics and in our institutions, and they need to be really supportive of, hopefully, cancer trials, but if they're good tertiary centres, research in general across the specialties.
Do you think have you seen big changes in how clinical trials, I guess, are perceived or supported over your time in medicine?
There's certainly been major changes in how clinical trials are done. They're much more complex now than they used to be. You need to do a lot more trials because a lot of trials are really for small populations, and there's not that many trials that are just open to anybody with an advanced cancer anymore. And you have to have that backup of molecular testing to ensure that you're finding the right patients for the right trials. In terms of institutional supports, I think, fortunately, the major tertiary centres around the country are reasonably supportive still of their physicians doing clinical research and bringing clinical trials, although it has become a bit more difficult. It is a little more bureaucratic, if you like. There are still delays in many centres. And one of the advantages that I found in working with Linear is, as a private not-for-profit institution, it doesn't have the top-heavy bureaucracy that a lot of major hospitals do.
Yeah, I think people in the private sector shudder at some of the things that are still happening in the public sector in terms of communication and bureaucracy, as you mentioned. But I guess most of our clinical trials currently are probably still in that public environment. So we work with the conditions that we've got. Michael, you've already alluded to this in some way, but where do you see lung cancer or thoracic malignancy treatment in 10 years time? I know you said you can't make predictions, but if you had to predict, where do you think we're heading? What are the big advances?
Yeah, I think that's very hard to be too specific about. I think there will be major advances, and I think we will have even more personalisation of treatment than we do now. We haven't yet found particularly good predictors of current IO drug benefit or toxicity, which I think will come along. But who knows? And we know that in thoracic cancers, there is still such an important role for non-medical oncology treatments, and they are growing and developing as well. What I would hope would happen, if we're talking about a 10-year time frame, is that we would have a linked network of accredited comprehensive cancer centres across Australia. So we would have a lot more commonality in terms of protocols, procedures, data collection than we do now. I would very much like that to happen for Australia, because I think that would also be a big boost forward to better outcomes compared to what we have now. I'm pretty confident that will occur everywhere, perhaps except in Western Australia, where we seem to be lagging.
I hope you're right in terms of the national incumbent. I'm sure that WA will be part of that, hopefully, Michael. But you're right. I guess we're a small, relatively small population, big geography. Having pooling resources and knowledge and patient data seems like a no-brainer and seems like it should be something that's achievable. But since we're in a federal system, it doesn't always work that way, does it? Michael, any final comments or thoughts or things that I haven't asked you about that you think are important to convey to the listeners of the podcast?
I can't think of anything that you should have asked me that you didn't. It's very gratifying to hear your kind words at this stage of my career. I'm not stepping away from medical oncology or clinical research completely for some time, but it's been wonderful to work in the thoracic oncology space. It's been wonderful to work with TOGA for a very long time. And I look forward to becoming and maintaining myself as part of TOGA and seeing everyone in TOGA at various meetings in the years to come.
We're very happy for that as well, Michael. And this podcast represents in no way a swan song podcast. It's a chat with a senior experienced clinician. So we look forward to many more ASMs, scientific committee meetings and interactions. And I'm sure you're going to continue to be at the forefront of clinical research in lung cancer in Australia. Michael, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Would never have picked this 25 years ago in that tutorial, chowing down on some leftover MDM food, that we'd be sitting here chatting in a thoracic malignancy podcast 25 years later. Like you said, you just can't predict where your career is going to end up.
You certainly can't.
So it's been a real honour and look forward to seeing you at future TOGA events and other events. So please, everyone, thank Mike for joining us during this discussion. As always, to our listeners, thanks for listening to TOGA's Conversations in Lung Cancer Research. And if you enjoy our show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Thank you, Mel.